Hello all, and so this is going to be our conclusion and summation video, as well as just giving some of my own thoughts on our study of Plato over the last couple of months on the channel. And so if we were going to surmise really Plato's theory and create a sort of summary out of this to guide people through Plato's teachings, I would say that the core tenet would really be thought through with the divided line analogy, where, of course, the structure being that one side being his epistemological view of knowledge and opinion, and on the other side, where we'll have the objects of knowledge and opinion, and you have the differences between form and particular. And of course, form being what Plato is really all about, we would see this model of unchanging eternal forms in which somehow the particulars are going to participate and be related to these unchanging eternal principles that aren't conformed to the constrictions of space and time. And so out of this we can relate this theme through this model of epistemology and the forms, that we'd see how he would view the forms towards his views of ethics, of the state of the human soul, politics, education, the good, which is related in many cases in his writings towards God. And if we turn to the Republic, I also wanted to shore up this with regards to history, because in the Republic he has a sort of nod of towards or an inkling towards a philosophy of history, where he talks about the four forms of government, and they're really characteristic of the spirited and the appetite, or the desirous soul, if you will. Those categories of desirous and the spirited, the honorable, if you will, they contain the seeds really of their own destruction unless they are ultimately ruled by reason. And we can go from the rule of the philosopher king, of a kingdom that's truly ruled by reason, and anything that strays away, if you will, is change, which of course at the time with the Greeks, change and innovation is not seen how we see it today, with having a sort of goodness, at least interpreted through innovation. In today's world, innovation was more in the lines of distortion for the Greeks, to stray away, if you will. And so these changes then from the kingdom of reason, or at least the goal of having reason at the forefront of a civilization, is one of decay. It's to move down the divided line, if you will. And so these different forms of government will cycle through, and they'll give way to the next one in this sort of cyclical series that goes from the top and then continues to go down. Then eventually it'll go down far enough, you'll have decayed enough to reinvigorate the process again, and you start a new system, or you have the old adage, as it goes, of the sort of cliche now of hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times, which creates strong men again. And so that adage fits perfectly really with how Plato sees governments here. And to add a little depth to this, we see the aristocracy, or the honorable spirit, eventually give way to their heirs, who no longer rule with this kinship of the hard times, if you will, of a group of men overcoming a challenge, a war, if you will, and the accolades that come with that. But there is that honor that's created between a certain generation, and eventually, of course, that generation has to move on to the next world. And so you then have these heirs who were not ultimately a part of that, great challenge that that generation prior created honor out of. And so you then get a tyrant who, really only knows the satisfaction of the glory of the honorable, but he himself has forgotten how to be honorable. And so he rules by force, and the tyrant has to resort to repression to get the same sort of respect, if you will. It's one of fear, of reverence of the tyrant ruling down onto you. And so in reaction to this, you give way to the next. The tyrant then gives way to the demos of the city. The people then rise up and they take over, and then you have the start of a democracy. And of course, democracy is associated with mob rule, and the mob is going to be subjugated to the rhetorics of maybe a few sophists or individuals that then rise up over the mob and form a sort of oligarchy. And then that oligarchy, when they start to rule, there's a fracturing that happens again, because within this group you're going to have a split set of people who are going to overachieve over these oligarchs, a rising of the cream to the top, if you will. And so then they splinter into that very aristocracy we had to begin with, repeating this process over and over again. So history for Plato and these attributes to government is very much one of the cyclical. There's no linear time here. There's no idea of progress, if you will. And so Plato believes that until we, align the king and the philosopher, we'll never have peace on earth. But, the philosopher, even when we examine that, we can't, conform it to today's standards of what a philosopher stands for. We usually kind of think of the academic in the ivory tower and the intellectual, if you will. The philosopher and all the credentials that come with that. The philosopher here is, really the lover of wisdom. And if you're the lover of wisdom for Plato, then you're also going to be the lover of the good, and you're going to know the good and be able to transmit the good to the people around it that are reciprocal to the good. And, I think, one of the most rewarding things to see out of this view here is how, despite all of the innovation, we ultimately, and Plato is a philosopher really of the soul, in my opinion, that it is still the same soul. It is still our same, souls. Nothing's really changed in that aspect. We, still have appetite and still have these motivations that, despite the fact that there could be changes with civilizations through the millenniums, technology, of course, comes into play, the mediums, if you will, of how, the messages of the soul move around in your city. I think we could perhaps look at how, this is why politics are so radical. And, I must say that this seems to be somewhat of a false adage. For most of my lifetime now, I've been told that, we're living in this particular radical time in the 21st century in the West, where, there's ideologues running rampant. And how can we perhaps, distinguish ourselves as somehow different from these same problems that Plato is facing with regards to, the sophists and the state of the soul, our relationship to the spirit, and an appetite. And so I don't really believe anymore this, idea that we are living in this particular radical time in politics. If we want to talk about social cohesion decaying in the course of my 30-year life, if you will, then maybe that's an entire discussion. But the idea that politics weren't radical, at that point either, and of course the '60s is considered a radical time. The point being really that politics is so radical because we're ultimately talking of the evaluation of soul, which I credit very much to studying Plato here. And so I've always asked people to consider that, and perhaps the idea of somehow alleviating radical politics, of ideologues, of things of that nature might be a vain task, simply because it's something that clearly we've had going on, and it doesn't seem, if we consider this, that politics really is the evaluation of souls, then we're going to still have souls until the end of this civilization and the start of a next civilization, or until the end of time, if you like, for human beings, as it were. We're still going to have souls, and we're still going to have to contend with the fact that there is differences between the soul. And if we're talking of souls, of ways of life, straying from the good life, the virtuous, to one of appetite, to the self-serving, then this is clearly a problem that's not going to go away, and perhaps offers an explanation into why politics is so quote-unquote radical, if you will. Now, moving discussions, I want to talk then about the cosmological cycle, really, of how we can piece together what Plato says about, or at least offers us up about, history, and look at his cosmological cycle and how that also links together and overlaps in a big way with integration and disintegration. This shows that there's the path of the individual soul going up and down, which is also tied into the cosmological aspect of reincarnation, of a lifetime moving up and down this life, and then they start the next life, and maybe they're aiming more towards the good of the sun, if it will, or the source, and then you have another life where you slip back down that line. And so you can see here how his cosmology is also going to play into history, and this goes back to that really thesis of the divided line. And we see this echo even going to the Stoics, where you have the notion of the cosmos going through a sort of developmental aspect, and then you have chaos and destruction, which gives way to the Heraclitean fire. Of course, the Stoics were indebted in a lot of ways to Heraclitus and his idea of fire giving chaos, and then renewing up like a phoenix rising from the fiery ashes. And so this then is contrasted, and I want to brush up on this to really show how when we're talking about Plato, we have to talk about this in a way of, this is how Plato saw the world, in comparison to how our theological really developments and views of history are going to reflect out of that. Because the contrast here is to compare the developments of progress, where we have the divine in the Christian moving towards a destiny, and we have the idea of a linear history as compared to this cyclical view. And it's an important contrast to really wrap your head around, I think, if you really want to understand the Greeks in general. And so, in order to get unchanging truth or achievement that is everlasting, and with that notion, we can understand why, the forms, since they're unchanging in truth and trying to achieve it, what is everlasting after all, then our participation in reality, our participation in history and time and space is truly one of instability. And so history is very unstable for Plato, as it turns out. It's always changing and going through these cycles to be, renewed and destroyed. You have the chaos, and then you have form reemerging, and civilization and structure. And, it's easy to see how the Greeks then, because reality itself, we could say, has a sort of antagonism towards getting us to the eternal truth, then we could see why they would be, focused on shedding this body, becoming more intimate with the soul within you, within what's eternal and unchanging, and to ultimately escape this reality that doesn't give us perfect geometry, that doesn't give us perfect and whole truths. We should want to shed this body and shed this life. This is a prison, and that's why, and famously, when Socrates is to be executed, he thanked them, because for the philosopher king that Socrates stood for, getting out of this world, getting away from the imprisonment of this lived body, moves you closer, or even closer to the sun than this life could even give you. And so it makes sense, really, if you take that to heart here, why the Greeks would have their views towards life in this world and life to be afterwards, and to be reincarnated again. So as the historian Oswald Spengler would discuss with regards to new civilizations, new ideas, having a sort of pseudomorphosis from the shadow of the civilization before them, we could really see that play out in history with the early Christians, who come in with these ideas of having life everlasting, and Paul talking about the resurrection of the dead, and this is clearly contentious with the Greek view of life and death, and shedding this bodied prison. Why would we want to have this body back? We're moving, we're to be evaluated and reincarnated, and hopefully we moved up, and so we'll have a new place in the world, and what needs to be carried out in that sort of cyclical view is to be done, and the sooner the better. Why would we want to come back to what we were before? And so the Greeks, especially the well-read Platonists, of course, would not really see this resurrection of the body as a good, and the idea of everlasting life as a way of continuing to live in this chaotic realm, of being bound to it, which is a scary thought for ancient Greece. And so only until they shed this pseudomorphosis eventually, as Spengler would discuss, you get further into the Christian lineage, we then start to see the notion of a creation as goodness made with purpose and intent. And so with that, with the the idea of the divine having not just a creation but a cause, and a cause towards goodness, and the intention of that creator, then we give room to have linear history, or the resurrection of the body. And you can even perhaps see pieces of this foreshadowing with Plato, because it's as I discussed in those last videos when we talked about his views on cosmology, that relationship that he really had with ideas of the architect, eventually having the need to interact with its creation to push it towards goodness. And it's not well known if it's consistent, because sometimes in some of the dialogues the creator or the divine has a different relationship, and then you have the cyclical view as well, where the architect steps away from the creation to, give way for evil, for chaos, to then balance back out. But if we take that, we could, perhaps posit how, the early Christians, many of them, of course, are going to be indebted to Plato. We're all indebted to Plato in a lot of ways. We could see that, eventually Christianity will come along and say, no, there is always intent. There is always, a creation of goodness. And with that, we'll have historical processes that are orientated towards a progress of this great achievement. And now to end here, I wanted to give a couple thoughts with regards to our world today and some of the challenges we face and how it relates to the dialectical notion, which of course is not dead at all. It simply has changed in the mediums, but the message remains the same. And despite the fact that we live in quite an atomized world, we're talking of the loneliness pandemic, this need for historical social institutions that paved our ways of life for millenniums, are now eroding away. They aren't really seen in the public sphere anymore, in the real, if you will, the real world. It's now transferring to the hyperreal, to, as Baudrillard would say, or hypermodernity is a term that I like to use from John David Ebert. And we've seen in the last couple of decades that we're starting to understand more of, as these online spheres continue to rise and start to really mold our social institutions more and more as compared to the historical church, the historical community, and the Greek city-state, if you will. We still have this dialectical raging on. It's just simply now that it's really the company that you're keeping in the hypermodern sphere on the internet. Really, it seems to have ramifications for your thoughts. For there's a lot of interesting stuff where you look around and someone discovers new content in a new community, and they start talking like them. They start using the same phrases, the same sort of memetics, if you will. This is always been the case, because I think us as human beings, we have this sense of community and belonging. It's just now in the server. It's now online, really. And so just because the game, the chessboard has changed, if you will, it's added some new dimensions to it, or if you like a sort of cyber space adage to it, that doesn't change the fact that these same problems, this same need for the dialect to discuss these matters, to discuss problems and knowledge and the good life, as it were. This is still raging on, and it's still the project of Plato. It's just a couple of millenniums have went by, and yeah, the people have changed, but since it is still the philosophy of the eternal. It's the philosophy of the soul. That is always going to stay with us, and that journey is going to keep going. It's just the ramifications and the environment has changed. And I think now, to really end here, I want to perhaps, lay a sort of foundation of, where I see, despite the fact that we're looking at this very old book, where, politics and the social, if you will, is going to continue to keep going. And I think it really will have to do with these online communities who will somehow form a sort of synthesis of having the access of the real world and the online sphere sort of in tandem together, a sort of synergy out of that, or even a harmony, if you will. And so being able to act in the processes of the real, or those institutions that we've inherited, and reconciling that with this new technology is really going to be the path forward. And I suppose, to be more concrete about that, we could see, just as with Plato's governments, groups of honorable men gathering together to impose their will on the world, and collectively use their resources together for their way of life. And so that's really what I think is going to happen in the future, as more and more of these historical institutions, the idea of the geographical nation state, if you will, is given way to this globalization, where you'll have people connecting to each other all across the world, unified through commonality out of using this technology. And whatever the consequences will be out of that are to be, whether it's good or bad, that's up to you. But I do think that will be the direction that we continue to go into, is groups of and probably really small groups. It won't be like everyone kind of has this idea that the revolution just kind of like sweeps in overnight, and suddenly all the demos of the cities is on your side. I don't think that's the case at all. I think it'll be these small disenfranchised splinter groups who will use these technologies to be able to coordinate into the praxis of the real around them. And with that, I think that really ends what I have to discuss with you guys about Plato. And of course, in ending with Plato, we are going to then start up with his most famous student of all, which is Aristotle. And I hope you guys will join me for that. And make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you for when we start up with Aristotle.